In Harlem 1935, Dutch Schultz insulted Bumpy Johnson in public inside the Cotton Club, daring him to respond. 7 days later, 8 men were dead and Schultz's Harlem operation disappeared without a war. How does power win when no one ever pulls the trigger? On Monday night, September 16, 1935, the Cotton Club was functioning exactly as it was meant to. Harlem supplied the music and the danger. Downtown Manhattan supplied the money and the rules. White patrons filled the front tables beneath low chandeliers, drinking illegal whiskey as if prohibition were a rumor. Black performers owned the stage while Black Harlem itself remained locked outside the velvet rope of its most famous nightclub. Near the back of the room, away from applause and attention, Bumpy Johnson sat alone. He was not hiding. He was watching quietly, deliberately. Johnson did not drink fast or speak to anyone nearby. Witnesses later recalled that he barely moved his attention, fixed not on the show, but on the room and the people in it. Across the club closer to the music, Dutch Schultz had been drinking since early evening. His table was loud, crowded, and confident, the posture of a man who believed the night already belonged to him. Schultz had been pushing into Harlem for months, forcing black policy operators out one by one. By that night, he believed the last resistance had already broken. When Schultz stood up, it was not subtle. Chairs scraped the floor and his bodyguards rose, immediately reacting before anyone else could process what was happening. He did not walk calmly. He moved fast and unsteady, cutting straight across the room. Powerful men do not cross crowded rooms unless something is about to happen. The music faltered. Conversations thinned. By the time Schultz reached Johnson's table, the room had already begun to hold its breath. Schultz did not lower his voice or lean in. He slammed his hand onto the table hard enough to spill Johnson's drink, the glass rattling as the bourbon spread. The sound was sharp and final. Every eye in the Cotton Club turned toward them. Schultz spoke loudly and without restraint, making sure the entire room heard every word. He used racial language that carried weight even in 1935, especially in a whites-only room inside Harlem. What mattered was not just what he said, but where he said it. This was public humiliation delivered in front of more than 200 witnesses who understood exactly what it meant. Johnson did not interrupt him. He did not stand flinch or reach for the gun everyone knew he carried. The silence that followed was not fear of violence. It was the sound of a line being crossed. For several seconds, no one spoke. Even Schultz's own men hesitated, unsure whether they were watching a confrontation or a mistake. Johnson finally looked up. His expression did not change and his voice did not rise. Witnesses later described his response as calm, low, and unsettling. There was no anger in it, only certainty. He gave Schultz 7 days. No explanation followed, no conditions added. Schultz laughed, loudly, confidently. A laugh meant to reassure the room that nothing had changed. He turned back toward his table, mocking the moment as entertainment. To him, the encounter was already finished. Johnson stood, adjusted his coat, and walked toward the exit without another word. No one stopped him. No one followed. The crowd parted as he passed, not out of fear, but instinct. People step away from things they do not yet understand. No recording captured what was said that night. What remains are consistent recollections from people who had no reason to coordinate their stories. Schultz stayed and drank. Johnson disappeared into Harlem. At the time, it looked like submission. By morning, it would look like something else entirely. No police report was filed. No incident was logged. But everyone in that room understood the same thing as they returned to their conversations. What had just happened was not an insult, it was a trap, and someone had already stepped into it. When the room fell quiet, Bumpy Johnson did nothing that night expected him to do. He did not stand. He did not reach inside his jacket. He did not raise his voice or his eyes. In a place where reputations were defended with violence, stillness was the most dangerous response. Several men in the room later said the moment felt wrong, as if a rule had been broken without anyone touching a weapon. Johnson let Schultz finish speaking. He waded through the insults, the laughter, the attention drawn from every corner of the club, and he did not interrupt once. When he finally spoke, it was not loud enough to command the room. People leaned forward instinctively, unsure if they were about to hear a threat or something worse. He did not insult Schultz back. He did not defend his pride. He did not argue ownership or territory. He gave a timeline. 7 days. The words were delivered without emotion, without emphasis, and without explanation. Not as a warning, not as a challenge. It sounded closer to a notice being issued than a threat being made. There were no conditions attached, no list of demands, no mention of retaliation. Just 7 days. Several witnesses later struggled to explain why that detail mattered so much. It was not the number itself, but the way it was stated, as if the outcome had already been decided, and the deadline was simply a formality. Johnson did not wait for a response. He did not watch Schultz's face for a reaction. He said what he came to say, and then he stopped talking. For a brief moment, no one moved. Even the band remained silent, caught between cues, unsure whether the night was about to explode or reset. Then Dutch Schultz laughed. It was loud and deliberate, the kind of laugh meant to reassure everyone within earshot that nothing serious had happened. Schultz threw his head back, repeating the number like a joke he couldn't believe had been told to him. 7 days. He turned the moment into theater, gesturing to his table, mocking Johnson, openly treating the statement as evidence of weakness rather than intent. In Schultz's world, threats were shouted, reinforced, and backed by immediate force. Anything else sounded like surrender. Johnson did not respond. He did not correct Schultz's interpretation. He did not restate the deadline or explain what would follow. He let Schultz misunderstand him completely. That silence did more damage than any argument could have. A few men near Schultz shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something important had just passed without being acknowledged. Schultz waved it away and returned to his drink. To him, the encounter was finished, resolved in his favor by laughter alone. Johnson stood slowly. There was no rush, no dramatic pause. He adjusted his coat, turned toward the exit, and walked away without looking back. No one stopped him. No one followed. The crowd opened instinctively as he passed, not because they feared him in that moment, but because they did not understand what they had just witnessed. Outside, Harlem continued as it always did. The streets were loud, crowded, alive. Inside the Cotton Club, the night resumed, but something had shifted. People talked quieter. Some avoided eye contact. Others watched Schultz more closely than before. There was no declaration of war that night. No agreement was signed. No challenge was formally issued. Nothing on paper marked what had just happened. But the men who heard Johnson speak remembered the tone, the timing, and the absence of emotion. They remembered that he had not argued, negotiated, or defended himself. He had simply announced a window. By the time the club closed and the last glasses were cleared, most people believed they had just witnessed a humiliation. By morning, it would become clear they had witnessed something else entirely. Not a confrontation. A countdown. Inside the Cotton Club, the night did not end with an argument. It ended with laughter, loud enough to convince the room that nothing serious had occurred. Dutch Schultz returned to his table smiling, replaying the moment as entertainment. He told the story again and again, exaggerating details, pausing for effect, making sure everyone understood who had walked away, laughing. In his version, the insult had worked. The silence that followed was proof of submission, not restraint. The 7 days were a joke, something to repeat between drinks. Men at his table laughed when Schultz laughed. Others smiled because they knew better than to interrupt a man who believed he had just won. The band resumed. Drinks were ordered. The club settled back into its routine, but the energy had changed. Conversations dropped in volume, and people spoke with one eye on Schultz, as if waiting for something else to happen. Across the room, the chair where Bumpy Johnson had been sitting remained empty. He did not return. He did not linger. He did not make a second appearance for the benefit of witnesses. Johnson had walked out of the Cotton Club without urgency, without looking back, and without leaving instructions. Within minutes, he was gone from the room, then from the street, then from public view entirely. No one saw him argue outside. No one reported a confrontation at the door. He simply vanished into Harlem, absorbed by the city that knew how to hide its own. Inside, Schultz kept talking. He described Johnson as finished, broken, humiliated in front of the entire room. Each retelling made the victory larger, cleaner, more final. The confidence was contagious. Some of Schultz's men relaxed for the first time that night, reassured by the performance. Others noticed something off, but said nothing. In Schultz's world, power announced itself loudly. Silence was not a strategy he respected. What Schultz did not notice was who stopped laughing. A few operators near the back of the club avoided the story altogether. Others excused themselves, early leaving without explanation. They had heard Johnson's voice. They remembered the lack of emotion, the absence of heat, the way the words had been delivered like a date on a calendar. By midnight, the story had already begun to travel beyond the club. It moved table to table, then street to street, changing slightly each time, but keeping the same core detail. Johnson had not reacted. That detail unsettled people more than the insult itself. In Harlem, restraint was rarely confused with weakness, especially when it came from a man who had survived as long as Johnson had. Schultz stayed late drinking and holding court. He went to bed believing the problem had been solved publicly and permanently. He believed Harlem had watched its last challenge collapse without resistance. There was no police visit that night. No report was filed. No authority recorded what had been said or how it had landed. The Cotton Club closed as it always did. Lights dimmed floors, cleared history, wiped clean for the next evening's performance. Johnson did not reappear the following day. He did not attend meetings. His usual routine stopped without explanation. Phones rang and were not answered. Doors remained closed. Familiar faces were suddenly unavailable. Some took this as confirmation that Schultz had been right. Others recognized it as preparation. By morning, Schultz's laughter had already lost its audience. The story was still being told, but no one was laughing anymore. There is no evidence that Schultz and Johnson ever spoke again after that night. No meeting was arranged, no apology was offered, no terms were discussed. What remained was a room full of witnesses who had seen a line crossed a man walk away and another man laugh too long. The laughter did not end the confrontation. It sealed it. And once sealed, there was no way to reopen it, only to wait for what followed. 6 hours and 43 minutes after Bumpy Johnson walked out of the Cotton Club, the first body was discovered in Harlem. It was still dark, the hour when the city convinces itself that nothing important ever happens. A sanitation worker noticed a metal drum behind a warehouse on West 150th Street that had not been there the night before. It was heavier than it should have been, and the smell reached him before he touched the lid. When the drum was opened, the morning took a different shape. Police arrived without sirens, treating the scene at first as routine. That changed when the body was pulled free. The injuries were not rushed or chaotic, and they did not suggest panic. They were deliberate and methodical. Someone had taken time and had not been interrupted. The man had been beaten, stabbed, and handled in a way that suggested instruction rather than rage. This was not a killing meant to end quickly or quietly. Pinned to the clothing was a short note written in block letters. The message was simple enough that no officer needed it explained. Detectives stood longer than usual, reading the paper again and again. Several later said the same thing. It did not feel like an ending. By sunrise, word moved through precincts north of Central Park. This was not a robbery and not a personal dispute. It was not random, but no one could yet say what it was. The absence of a clear motive made the silence heavier. The victim was identified within hours. He worked Harlem routes, collected money, and answered to people who did not appear in paperwork. That detail altered the tone of the investigation. Questions became quieter and more careful. Officers from the New York City Police Department began tracing movements, contacts, and recent changes in routine. They found patterns, but no obvious trigger. There had been no argument reported the night before, no gunfire, and no disturbance logged. What investigators could not ignore was timing. 6 hours and 43 minutes earlier, a public confrontation had ended at the Cotton Club. On paper, that meant nothing. In Harlem, timing meant everything. The estimated time of death immediately became a problem. Different examiners offered overlapping windows, but none exact enough to close the question. That uncertainty created cover. It allowed the case to remain open without committing to a conclusion. By mid-morning, Harlem felt it before the newspapers did. It was not panic, but awareness. People noticed which doors stayed closed and which phones went unanswered. They noticed that Johnson was nowhere to be found. At the same time, Dutch Schultz was being told about the body. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence. One dead man in Harlem meant little by itself. That confidence lasted until he heard about the note. Witnesses later described Schultz going quiet. He was not angry or explosive, but controlled in a way that unsettled his own men. Orders followed quickly and without explanation. Johnson was to be found immediately. Money was offered and favors promised. Pressure moved outward through Harlem. Nothing came back. There was no location and no rumor that could be acted on. By afternoon, detectives adjusted their language. They stopped calling it a murder and began calling it a signal. Still, no one said that publicly. Naming it would have meant acknowledging what might follow. There was no suspect they could charge without inviting something larger. There was no arrest that would not escalate the situation. The body was logged and the note was photographed. The file remained open. So did the clock. By evening, Harlem moved differently. People walked their usual routes but watched longer and spoke less. No one knew who would be next or if there would be a next. What they did know was that a deadline had been spoken the night before, and the first mark had appeared almost immediately. 6 hours and 43 minutes was not coincidence. It was confirmation. Whatever had been set in motion inside the Cotton Club was no longer theoretical. It had crossed into action. The city now faced a question it could not answer yet. This was either a warning or the first number in a countdown that would not stop. By the afternoon of the first killing, Bumpy Johnson was already gone. He was not missing and he was not hiding nearby. He had erased his routine completely. His apartment showed no sign of panic or flight. There were no torn drawers, no half-packed bags, and no neighbor who claimed to have seen him leave in a hurry. Phones rang without answers, and messengers returned with nothing. For men who understood Harlem, that silence carried meaning without explanation. Johnson did not disappear because he was cornered. He disappeared because the board had already been set. Across the city, Dutch Schultz began asking questions. At first, they were casual, framed as curiosity rather than concern. Then the tone changed. Money appeared, favors followed, and threats were allowed to hang without being spoken directly. Harlem did not respond. People listened, nodded politely, and gave Schultz nothing he could act on. Searches began quietly and then turned aggressive. Apartments were checked, back rooms opened, and policy banks already closed were forced anyway. What Schultz's men found were empty chairs and familiar faces who suddenly remembered nothing. What they did not find was Johnson, and that absence unsettled them more than resistance. No one looked afraid. The calm was not confidence, but discipline. The strategy revealed itself through restraint. Johnson had removed himself before Schultz could point violence in any clear direction. Without a visible target, retaliation lost its shape. Force without direction becomes noise, and noise attracts attention. That vacuum created space for rumors to circulate without correction and for fear to choose its own form. Some said Johnson had left New York entirely. Others said he was still nearby, close enough to hear everything and far enough to touch nothing. Both versions traveled quickly. Neither could be disproven. Schultz increased pressure as the day wore on. Collectors were told to press harder, and enforcers were sent to remind people who controlled the money. The reminders failed. Harlem closed ranks without a meeting, without a signal, and without anything that could be traced. People did not protect Johnson out of loyalty alone. They protected him because they had seen the insult delivered in public and understood its meaning. This disappearance was not read as fear. It was read as preparation. Police activity increased by evening but remained unfocused. There was no suspect they could name and no pattern they could yet charge. Detectives noted the quiet. It was not the calm of resolution, but the stillness that comes before repetition. Schultz's confidence thinned hour by hour. Not because one man was dead, but because there was no one to strike back at. He could threaten neighborhoods and pay informants. He could not locate the single name that mattered. Without that name, escalation became dangerous. Every wrong move risked another body with no warning attached. The city adjusted without announcement. People walked the same streets but listened longer and watched corners more carefully. Every unanswered question felt intentional. Every delay felt engineered. Johnson issued no statements and offered no denials. He did not need to because absence was doing the work for him. By nightfall, the first killing no longer felt isolated. It felt instructional. Schultz went to sleep knowing his men were exposed. He also knew that striking blindly would only multiply consequences he could not control. Somewhere in the city, Johnson remained unseen. He was not holding court and not directing traffic, but waiting. In Harlem, people understood something before the authorities did. This war was not being fought with movement, it was being won through silence. The second body appeared the next morning, and no note was required to explain what it meant. The timing alone established the pattern precise enough to remove doubt. Harlem stopped counting hours and began counting days because the sequence had announced itself. Each death arrived on schedule, evenly spaced without urgency or spectacle. The methods varied just enough to avoid repetition, but the rhythm never changed. What mattered was not how the men died, but when they were found. There was no attempt to strike Dutch Schultz directly. No gunman rushed his headquarters, and no public challenge was issued. The violence avoided the center and moved methodically through the structure that kept his operation alive. Collectors disappeared first, followed by runners and coordinators who handled routes and enforcement. Men responsible for money stopped breathing one by one, removed without ceremony. Each death eliminated a function, not a symbol. Police laid photographs side by side, searching for inconsistency. Instead, they found order that felt deliberate. Different streets and different wounds produced the same result, confirming that another day had been used. By the fourth body, Harlem no longer pretended the killings were unrelated. People adjusted routines quietly, canceling meetings and changing routes without explanation. The neighborhood learned how to move inside the gaps left behind. Schultz heard about each death before the newspapers printed names. The information reached him faster than reassurance ever could. At first he reacted with anger, then denial, and finally calculation. Protection was ordered and then doubled with bodyguards added and schedules erased. Cars were swapped and movements altered, but none of it slowed the count. Each body appeared as if no defensive move had been made at all. By the fifth day, Schultz stopped raising his voice. Witnesses later said his sentences shortened and his tone flattened. He began listening more than speaking, a change that unsettled the men around him. What disturbed him was not the violence itself, but the absence of negotiation. No call came asking for terms, and no message offered an alternative. The countdown continued regardless of reaction. Police attempted to get ahead of the sequence by leaning on informants. Those informants suddenly remembered nothing and avoided stations altogether. Warnings were issued, but protection was quietly declined. Files grew thicker while cooperation disappeared. Statements contradicted each other and then stopped entirely. The investigation gained volume but lost traction. By the sixth body, everyone understood what was happening. No one could prove it, and no one needed it explained. The meaning circulated without paperwork. The killings did not create chaos in Harlem. They created order through fear and predictability. People watched closely, not in panic, but recognition. This was not a war spilling into the streets. It was a demonstration unfolding with discipline. One man died, then another, then another. Schultz began missing meetings and stopped appearing where he was expected. He started moving men out quietly under cover of darkness. Some operators left Harlem, others left the city entirely. The seventh body arrived without spectacle. There was no crowd, no chase, and no sound that carried. Just another count removed and another function erased. At that point, Schultz was no longer calculating outcomes. He was counting what remained. The list had become shorter than the days left to stop it. No announcement was made and no surrender declared. The killing slowed and then stopped, not because of intervention, but because the purpose had been met. The countdown ended without ceremony. Police reviewed the cases again and found nothing new. Too many witnesses had not seen, not heard, and not remembered. Most of the files were quietly set aside. Schultz survived the week, but not intact. His Harlem operation no longer existed. The city understood that something had ended without being announced. What made the sequence terrifying was its restraint. Violence had been applied precisely and only where it was needed. No more and never less. No one ever claimed responsibility, and no document tied the deaths together. But Harlem remembered the order of them. One body per day had been enough. Police waited for the retaliation that history said must follow. Reporters kept space on the front page for headlines that never arrived. In Harlem and downtown alike, everyone prepared for a full-scale mafia war that felt overdue. Squads were reassigned and radios stayed hot through the night. Editors held presses and watched clocks. Gang lookouts expected gunfire because that was how these stories were supposed to end. Nothing happened. There were no mass shootings and no retaliatory raids. No convoys rolled through Harlem and no bodies piled up to announce escalation. The city held its breath and learned what restraint looked like. The absence confused investigators more than violence ever had. A war would have produced suspects' witnesses and patterns to follow. Silence offered none of that. Sources close to Dutch Schultz whispered about plans that never moved past talk. Meetings ended without orders and phones rang without decisions. Men left rooms believing something would be announced only to hear nothing. Police tried to confirm whether an all-out response had been authorized. No document surfaced and no reliable witness claimed to have heard the command. The expectation of war existed everywhere except on the record. Journalists chased tips that dissolved on contact. Anonymous calls promised movement and then went quiet. The story kept stalling because the event everyone expected refused to occur. In Harlem, the lack of violence felt deliberate. Streets stayed open and businesses kept hours as if the neighborhood understood the performance had already ended. What followed was not chaos, but a controlled return to routine. The gangs felt it too. Men who prepared for firefights stood down without explanation. The silence did not signal weakness. It signaled that the objective had already been met. Investigators noted the shift in tone. Threat assessments softened not because danger had passed, but because the danger had proven unnecessary. The threat had achieved compliance without firing a shot. Behind the scenes, intermediaries carried messages that were never written. Routes closed, collections stopped, and names disappeared from ledgers. The machinery powering the conflict simply powered down. No one could point to the moment it ended. There was no ceasefire, no handshake, no press leak to mark resolution. The war dissolved by not arriving. That was the false climax. Everyone expected a crescendo of violence and instead received a lesson in control. The outcome contradicted instinct and rewrote assumptions about how power concludes a conflict. Police files reflected the confusion. They recorded readiness without engagement and anticipation without incident. The absence of a triggering order left investigators with nothing to charge and nowhere to proceed. Reporters summarized the week with hedges and caveats. Phrases like appeared to and according to sources filled columns that lacked confirmation. The city learned how thin certainty can be when nothing explodes. The quiet had consequences. Without a war to cover, attention drifted and pressure eased. What remained was a changed map of influence that no one announced. In that space, Bumpy Johnson did not claim victory. He did not need to. The absence of retaliation spoke more clearly than any declaration could have. The lesson spread without attribution. Control does not require spectacle and dominance does not demand noise. Sometimes the highest peak in a story is the moment nothing happens. By the end of the week, the city stopped waiting. The expected war became a footnote to a quieter ending. What endured was the understanding that restraint had finished the job. There was no evidence a general attack was ever ordered. There was no proof it was even necessary. The false climax held because the conflict had already been resolved elsewhere. When the presses finally rolled, they printed analysis instead of breaking news. The war that never came became the story, and the silence once mistaken for delay was recognized as the conclusion. The eighth body was found without ceremony, and the count ended exactly where it was meant to. There was no surprise left in it, only confirmation. The number mattered more than the name. Police recognized the significance immediately, not because the killing was louder or crueler than the others, but because there was nothing left to remove. The machinery had been stripped down to its last moving part. By midday, whispers traveled faster than reports. Men connected to Dutch Schultz stopped answering calls, then stopped appearing altogether. Offices closed without explanation, routes went dark, and cash points dried up at once. There was no announcement and no signal anyone could quote. Trucks were not seen leaving in convoys, and guards were not posted to cover a retreat. The absence itself became the message. Harlem noticed the change before authorities did. Faces that had hovered on corners for months were gone, and the pressure that had tightened the streets loosened all at once. It felt less like victory than release. Investigators searched for proof of an order. They found none that could be entered into a file or sworn to in court. What they documented instead was a synchronized disappearance that defied paperwork. Reporters chased confirmation from sources who suddenly lacked memory. Phone calls were returned late or not at all, and meetings ended with careful language. No one claimed responsibility for leaving, and no one denied it either. The retreat did not look like defeat. It looked like calculation. Every remaining asset connected to Schultz and Harlem simply stopped functioning as if power had been switched off at the wall. The eighth death reframed the week. What had seemed like escalation now read as completion. The violence had not been building toward chaos. It had been counting toward an ending. Police logs reflected the shift. Complaints slowed. Patrols returned to routine, and emergency alerts went unanswered because they were no longer needed. The city did not celebrate. It recalibrated. There were no arrests tied to the final body. Witnesses remained uncooperative, and timelines stayed approximate. The case files thickened without growing clearer. Behind the scenes, intermediaries confirmed what no one would state on record. Schultz's men were gone from Harlem, not reassigned or regrouped, but removed from the board. The operation did not relocate, it dissolved. In that vacuum, Bumpy Johnson did not step forward to claim territory. There were no speeches, no photographs, and no overt gestures of control. The streets understood ownership without being told. The absence of spectacle mattered. By leaving quietly, Schultz avoided the public admission that a louder exit would have forced. By ending the count precisely, Johnson avoided the chaos that would have invited retaliation. Authorities struggled to summarize the outcome. A war had been expected and never arrived, and a withdrawal had occurred without orders anyone could produce. The conclusion resisted neat language. What remained was a changed map of influence. Harlem returned to its rhythms, but the memory of the count stayed close. 8 down meant 0 left, and everyone knew what that arithmetic implied. The final body closed the sequence without punctuation. There was no exclamation point and no period the city could point to. The silence did the work. In the days that followed, the story hardened into understanding. Respect had been enforced without proclamation, and power had shifted without banners. The retreat was complete because it did not announce itself. No document ever confirmed the command to leave. There was only the coordinated absence that followed the 8th death. In that gap, the city read the ending clearly enough. By the time officials tried to summarize the episode, it had already moved on. What endured was not the violence, but the restraint that finished it. 8 down 0 left nothing more needed to be said. After the 8th body, the city waited for a return that never came. Dutch Schultz did not test the silence or probe the borders again. Harlem simply vanished from his map. Weeks passed, then months, and the absence hardened into fact. Routes once contested remained untouched, and the names that had hovered around Harlem did not reappear. No announcement marked the decision, but the pattern never broke. In the underworld, memory travels faster than paperwork. Men repeated the sequence in low voices, not as legend, but as instruction. The lesson was simple, and it did not invite debate. Disrespect was no longer noise. It was risk. The rule did not require enforcement after that. It spread because everyone had watched what happened when it was ignored. Violence had arrived, calmly counted itself, and stopped exactly on time. White operators adjusted language before adjusting plans. Meetings ended sooner, tones softened, and insults disappeared from negotiations. Survival favored those who learned quickly. The city recorded no formal change. Police files closed without conclusions, and newspapers moved on to the next crisis. What endured was not written down. Then Bumpy Johnson returned. Not with escorts or ceremony, but by resuming visible routines as if nothing unusual had occurred. He walked streets that had been tense weeks earlier and found them quiet. There were no charges waiting for him. No indictment tied his name to the sequence, and no witness stepped forward to claim otherwise. The cases remained unresolved officially and permanently. Investigators understood the limits of proof. The deaths were separated by time and place, connected by implication rather than evidence. Without cooperation, the files stayed thin where they mattered most. Johnson did not comment on the past. He did not need to because silence had already answered the questions people were afraid to ask. His presence was treated as confirmation rather than provocation. Harlem noticed the difference. The pressure that had once tightened daily life did not return, and business resumed without contest. Control felt quieter but firmer. Other cities paid attention. Word traveled through clubs' back rooms and union halls stripped of embellishment. The arithmetic mattered more than the names. 8 down, 0 left. The rule survived because it was practical. It did not ask for loyalty or belief, only compliance. Anyone could follow it without pledging allegiance. Over time, the lesson lost its edge and became routine. New players were warned before mistakes could be made. Old players corrected themselves before words crossed a line. Years later, the absence still spoke. Schultz never re-entered Harlem's orbit, and no proxy tried to reopen the question. The border held without guards. Law enforcement reviewed the episode periodically and found nothing new. The lack of convictions did not weaken the conclusion. It clarified it. Power had shifted without a signature. Authority had been demonstrated without spectacle. The ending resisted the kind of closure institutions prefer. What survived was not a feud, but a boundary. Disrespect equaled self-destruction not because it was moral, but because it was inefficient to ignore. The rule lasted because it worked. By the time a new generation came up, the story was told as caution rather than myth. Names mattered less than outcomes. Harlem had taught the city how silence can legislate. The century turned and the rule remained intact. No banner announced it and no plaque recorded it. But everyone who needed to know knew. That was the legacy. Not 8 deaths, not a retreat, but a principle that outlived them both. And in the end, that principle proved harder to erase than any man. After 1935, Harlem changed in a way no official record could fully explain. No power entered the neighborhood again with open contempt. 8 men died not for territory, but because a public boundary had been crossed in front of witnesses. What made this moment historical was never the number of bodies. It was the war everyone expected that never came and the silence that followed instead. Violence stopped, order returned, and the city adjusted without a single announcement. There were no trials to point to and no verdicts to quote. Yet behavior changed, language softened, and lines stopped being crossed. That quiet shift lasted longer than any headline. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story stayed with you, press like, share it with someone who understands how real power works, and subscribe now so you don't miss the next investigation waiting to be uncovered. When no one is punished, no final shot is fired, and everything still changes. Do you believe justice was done? Or did power simply choose a smarter ending?